so often the biggest representation of keeping these wars going are the people who make a lot of money off it, and people who a lot of Americans love empire. They like to be strong and tough and don't get pushed around. But I really think that if an individual, and most Americans, if we would ask them, do you think it's a good idea for us to do anything that would promote a chance of us getting into armed conflict with the Russians? I don't know if many Americans would say, oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea.
Joining us today for a special interview here at the New American is Dr. Ron Paul, former congressman and former presidential candidate under both the Libertarian and Republican Party. Thank you, Dr. Paul, for joining us today here at the New American.
Christian, nice to be with you today.
Thank you so much. So right now in the news, Ukraine and Russia are all over, all the TV stations. The mainstream media in the U.S. and Europe have been portraying Ukrainian President Zelensky as a, quote, global hero who is warding off Russian aggression. And Zelensky has repeatedly asked NATO, the U.S. Congress, and the British Parliament to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. What are your thoughts about the U.S. potentially doing that?
Well, we shouldn't even be in a situation where anybody would dare to ask us to do that, because it should be none of our business, and it sounds dangerous. And under the current situation and circumstances, for us to do that actually will make the war worse and may make it spread even further and bring us into conflict with Russia. So, but if one followed the principles of a non-interventionist foreign policy, we wouldn't be involved in coups. We wouldn't have been a participant in the coup of 2014, and we wouldn't be in charge of NATO, and we wouldn't have precipitated, this conflict now, which is a NATO versus Russia conflict. And this whole idea that Zelensky and the Ukrainians feel so bold as to insist almost like we owe them something. Well, we owe them something, and that is mind our own business. We certainly haven't been able to justify stealing more money from the American people and exposing our citizens and our soldiers to greater danger by spreading ourselves into these very dangerous conflicts.
Absolutely. Well said, Dr. Paul. And what do you make of Poland's request to send, or idea to send their old MiG fighters that the Ukrainian pilots supposedly can operate, sending those to Ukraine, and then Poland would receive our F-16s? Is that a good idea, or is Biden in this one case maybe wise to say that's a bad idea?
Well, no, I think it was a bad idea. It's sort of ironic. Of course, if they weren't ours and it was theirs and they were doing it, then I'd say we shouldn't even be involved. But I thought it was so ironic that Russian planes were being delivered to the Ukrainians. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. So no, it would have expanded the war. Fairness, it seems like an impossible thing to achieve under these circumstances, because there's unfairness sort of on both sides, and everybody has an angle, and then there's so many interests involved, everything from the military-industrial complex. So no matter how much I might respect and want to have non-intervention, we have a lot of intervention. Then you have to start thinking, who's really behind all this? Why does it happen? It doesn't make any sense. And then you have individuals that don't quite understand, but who do they represent? So often, the biggest representation of keeping these wars going are the people who make a lot of money off it, and people who a lot of Americans love empire. They like to be strong and tough and don't get pushed around. But I really think that if an individual, and most Americans, if you would ask them, do you think it's a good idea for us to do anything that would promote a chance of us getting into armed conflict with the Russians? I don't know if many Americans would say, "Oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. I think we ought to work toward peace," and most of them will. But the propaganda machine, just as the propaganda machine was just unbelievably successful in rallying the cry, to stop COVID. Just think of all the mess that they made out of that. So the propaganda machine, whether it's social media or regular media or our university professors putting out all the bad information, it's really a tough job if your goal is to seek out truth and present it and try to convert people into looking for the truth rather than looking for which special interests am I going to be supporting.
Speaking before a meeting of the Business Roundtable, President Biden recently said,
as one of the top military people said to me in a secure meeting the other day, 60 million people died between 1900 and 1946. And since then, we established a liberal world order, and that hadn't happened in a long while. A lot of people died, but nowhere near the chaos. And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it. And we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it.
What is this new world order that President Biden is talking about, and should the U.S. have any role in leading it?
Well, it depends on how it comes together. I sort of like the idea of working for a new a new relationship with countries. And if you want to call it an order or something, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the UN type of a new world order where it's dictatorial and use of force, and they're going to have a military power to do it, and somebody's going to be divvying up the loot, and they're going to be putting on sanctions. You're going to have the World Bank and the IMF and NATO and all these groups very much involved. I think that's bad. I talk a lot about, how do you do it? Do you just ignore it? I say, no, you do your best job you can working to improve one's country. And we had a good start. Our founders had a pretty good understanding of what liberty was all about. They made an effort. It didn't turn out to be a perfect effort because people have ignored our Constitution. But no, we should work with that ideal to improve things. And then they say, well, how are they going to do what we want them to do if we don't have this new world order with a little bit of force and intimidation? Doesn't work, causes more trouble, undermines liberty. And what we want is to set a standard and get people to emulate us, and say, the Americans are really doing well. And there was this respect for our country, in times past, where say, there's something special about America. It's a free country, and we still have that, a lot of acceptance around the world with that, but we're fast losing it because the new world order is something that we're not thinking about because it's authoritarian. We want a world order which is voluntary and based on personal liberty, and that's 100% different than the new world order that they've been working on and unfortunately seem to be making progress. But the only answer is for us to do a better job promoting the principles of liberty here where we live and have a moral responsibility to deal with.
Now, shifting gears a little bit from President Biden to President Putin of Russia, on February 24th, when he announced that his country was going to have the special military operation, as he put it, in the Ukraine, Putin said in his national television address, in this context, in accordance with Article 51, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, with permission of Russia's Federation Council, and an execution of the treaties of friendship and mutual assistance with the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, ratified by the Federal Assembly on February 22nd, I made a decision to carry out a special military operation. Putin cited Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is the very same justification that Biden used last year when he unconstitutionally bombed Syria. And we've heard Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina say that we have to empower the International Criminal Court so we can go after Putin. We have to empower the ICC that's connected to the UN. What do you make of all this empowering of the UN, whether it's from Russia, whether it's from Lindsey Graham and Biden? Does the UN even promote world peace, or would we just be better off getting out of it altogether?
Yeah, well, we need to get out of it. And now that's the only thing that we can do. But if we get out of it and take away our finances and don't throw our weight around, I think the UN would probably become much less significant. But because we're in it and we throw our weight around, this is a big deal. But I remember very well because it annoyed me, although I was at a much younger age, and that had to do when the Korean War started. I was in high school, and I remember one of my teachers being drafted after he had been in World War II, went over there and got killed in Korea. And then as I looked into that as a teenager, I thought, well, what about this thing about in the Constitution that the war has to be declared? We just went through a war, it was declared. And if you looked at it just militarily, World War II, pretty amazing what they did rather quickly. And now we go into countries like Afghanistan for these all kinds of weird reasons, stay there for 20 years, then we have to decide, well, we failed, let's leave, after a lot of people were killed and they suffered. But the big thing about the Korean War was it was the first time that we were really involved in a significant war and pretended it wasn't a war and just said, oh, this is a little police activity that we're doing here. And Truman did that. So that was a big event, and that set the standard. And of course, there was no declaration of war in Vietnam. If wars are not won, if the people don't know about it and their representatives decide that we must do it, then it's more acceptable. So what happens is when they get careless and once they get into trouble, then they demand that we rescue the troops and send them more money and, get involved. And, when we argued the case for our argument against going into Iraq, the overwhelming number of Republicans and the most Democrats, they were all for this, to go to war against Saddam Hussein. He was a monster, and they did this mainly. I had them vote on a declaration of war, which they say, oh, that's horrible, horrible. We don't want to declare war. So they go to war, but they didn't want the responsibility. They wanted the president. Let him have his war, and then maybe some good will come of it. But if not, the president's fault. It wasn't Congress' fault. Exactly opposite of what the founders wanted. So it sounds complicated, but it's just that people would ask me after some of my speeches, it's complicated. What do you do? Well, you could start by reading the Constitution, and follow it. Because if you don't have the rule of law. And we haven't had the rule of law in entering wars since World War II.
Absolutely. And of course, you mentioned Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And of course, both President Bushes took us into Iraq. And the first President Bush, George Herbert Walker, the father, he, of course, used the pretext of the United Nations and the New World Order for going into Iraq and stopping Saddam Hussein then. And then, of course, his successor, Bill Clinton, issued the no-fly zone or enforced it in Iraq, which just set the stage for George W. Bush to go back and finish his father's business, so to speak, in Iraq. But now we're hearing Biden talk a lot about the U.S. commitment to NATO. So hypothetically, of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but let's say Russia intentionally or unintentionally were to attack Poland or some NATO member state. Is the U.S. bound to arbitrarily go to war without even debating it because of Article 5 of the NATO treaty?
Well, we shouldn't be. It should be unconstitutional, illegal, and people in office should be fired if they are doing that, because that's exactly what the founders advised us to avoid. Stay out of the entangling alliance and follow the Constitution. You mentioned about the no-fly zone in Iraq and all the bombing and the killing that went on for 10 years. And that was bin Laden used that as one of the 3 points he made on why 9/11 came about. So, one mistake leads to another. And that's why half of wars sometimes are every bit as bad, because they linger and they get worse and they involve more people and people are lulled to sleep. And because to me, a half of a war is sanctions and no-fly zone and tariffs and protectionism. All these things lead to more problems, but they're very painful. And I keep saying to people, yeah, you want to put more sanctions on Russia right now? Well, what if China comes in and puts their Navy in the Gulf of Mexico and prevents us from importing anything into the port of Houston? Don't you think you should be annoyed by that? But they don't think of it that way. They get conditioned because of the propaganda that empires are good and we're protecting you against the new world order, which is bad. Our order is perfect because we're good people and we do only good things. So anything for the use of force and disobeying, the principles of the rule of law are dangerous, and usually a lot of innocent people die, and we've seen that happen. I mean, like I said, I remember all this activity from World War II on, and I ended up getting drafted in the '60s, over Cuba and Vietnam. So that it's all of this stuff we're talking about is preventable. And what is so aggravating is we had a pretty good guideline, and that is the Constitution. So when you try to work out the details, is whether Putin should have done this or not. And most of the time you say, no, he shouldn't do it, but I'm not going to send my kids over there, to bomb Russia or even antagonize the situation and make it worse. That doesn't achieve anything.
Absolutely. You used to talk a lot, and you still do actually talk a lot about blowback in U.S. foreign policy. We'll go into one of these countries and remove someone we don't like and install someone that we think is better, and then all of a sudden, years later, the people in those countries resent the U.S.'s actions, and then or a neighboring country resents the actions that we took there, and then we have a worse problem down the road. For example, in Ukraine, it was President Yanukovych, who was democratically elected, and he was moving Ukraine away from the European Union against the interests of the globalists and the New World Order, and moving more towards the orbit of Russia and Russia's attempt to create a Eurasian economic union of their own. Well, of course, we didn't want that. We want Ukraine in the EU. At least that's the U.S. and the establishment foreign policy position. So they get rid of Yanukovych, and now we have a succession of pro-EU presidents in the Ukraine right now, with Zelensky being the current one. And now we see Putin, of course, going in there to try to prevent Ukraine's membership in the EU and NATO. But it was back in 2016 that us in the Liberty Movement, we were celebrating the United Kingdom having left or voting for Brexit. Now it's like we're doing the opposite by, well, not us, but those in the establishment and some even Republicans who are promoting Ukraine's entry into the EU. Should we even be promoting the Ukraine to be in the EU? And if the Ukraine somehow survives this invasion and they do join the EU, wouldn't that just further escalate Russia's desire to have another conflict in the future if it doesn't work this time around?
No, we shouldn't have anything to say about it. And I think the Europeans would be wiser if they weren't so dependent on us, because they have a natural tendency that they would like to have had a pipeline coming from Russia into Germany and into Europe. And yet we did not. But it was back to, the deep state who really runs the show. And certainly the oil industry has a big role to play in that. And so we wanted to sell it. And even right now, essentially we've stopped Russia from pursuing the pipeline, and the Europeans have even backed off. The Germans, decided they were going to resist, and now they're saying, well, I guess we're going to go along with it. But it's over oil too often. The same way in the Middle East and Afghanistan. It's not because they have a principled position of government, even though that might disagree with ours, and they're promoting this principle. No, it's power, it's wealth, it's control of government that motivate people to do this. So no, the people have been doing this for a long time. But right now, this whole thing in the Ukraine has a lot to do with oil. The Europeans, I think if we just walked away from that, not walk away in the sense of not dealing with them, because I want to engage with them. I want to be able to travel and see people. Everything has to be voluntary, and be able to go into these countries and set moral standards that they might follow voluntarily. Some people think non-interventionism is isolationism, and it really isn't. What is isolationism is what we're doing right now when we've been killing people and spending a lot of money isolating Russia all of a sudden out of clear blue after having a decade or so since the breakdown of the Soviet system of working more with Russia. But all of a sudden, though, we isolate them, and we do that. So, but they turn the argument around. They do it all the time in politics. If they are doing something, they blame their opposition. Just think of the political parties that we have today. If one political party is doing it and they're the most crooked and they lie the most, then they blame the other side for doing that, and they get away with it. So that's a problem. Is seeking out truth is really a job and a half.
Absolutely. And since we're running out of time, I'm just going to skip on ahead to a different topic. Speaking of political parties, you were, of course, have been elected as a Republican several times in Texas. What motivated you initially to run for office to begin with back in the 1970s?
Well, my motivation, people say, what made you decide to give up medicine and become a politician? I said, that never happened. Because I had no goal set out in my mind to get into Congress and be a politician. But I was very fascinated with Austrian free market economics and the monetary system, because I saw that as a big economic freedom issue. And the Austrian school, Mises and Hayek and the Murray Rothbard, had a lot of influence on me, so as well as Leonard Reed. So when the predictions that they made about the breakdown of Bretton Woods came in 1971 under Nixon, that really popped my eyes open. Boy, they were absolutely right. And so I thought, I felt motivated to talk about it. And in the 70s, we had 3 Republicans in Texas back then. The Republicans did not want to have anything to do with Watergate. Nobody was running for it. So I wanted to speak out. So I thought, well, maybe I just could get up there and tell them I'm an independent. I'll run as an independent and get to talk about what I think is important. Nobody wants to talk about. That's the Federal Reserve, a monetary issue. But the Republicans were in such shambles, they were willing to beg and plead that I put my name on their list because nobody else would do it. So that's how I got started. And that led to an election that I won in 1976. It was a special election because the Democrat had resigned. And so that got me involved. So my motivation has always been to deal in the issues and the politics of so it was guaranteed that I would never become chairman of the banking committee under the rules that were established. That is, you have to play the rules of conforming to the political party and conforming to their votes and conforming to their raising techniques. So it was to me to just have a forum, a place to speak out with. I had pretty low expectations. I thought, well, this is not for me. And my wife worried that it was dangerous because she was terrified that I might win. And I guaranteed her, in no way they're going to elect me, because I'm not going to run on welfareism and special interest. And yet something else happened.
You mentioned how you would never be in charge of the banking committee because of the rules of the Republican Party, and you've always been kind of an outlier within the Republican Party, never been in with the establishment of the party. But another outlier, who was a good friend of yours, was Congressman Larry McDonald, elected as a Democrat in Georgia, and nothing in common with any other Democrat elected in Congress, at least not in a century, since probably the days of Grover Cleveland. So what was your relationship with Larry McDonald when both of you served together in Congress?
Well, it was interesting because We were both MDs. We both had been flight surgeons. And one of the very first votes we cast together was over the swine flu vaccine. And Ford was president. And it was a political stunt. Everybody's going to get the flu shot. And so they had a rapid vote, emergency. It would sort of remind us a lot about what was going on recently. So there were two people who voted against it, Larry and I voted against that bill, which was long forgotten. But no, I knew Larry before I was elected. Matter of fact, I called him when I was thinking about running as an independent, just to get his advice. And he said, "Well, you should do what is, going to be the best chance to get your voice out there, and might get elected." So he more or less talked me out of running as an independent, and he says, and it made me decide, under the circumstances, to run as a Republican. So no, we knew each other very well. It was very tragic on what happened, and yet our views were very, very close. They weren't absolutely identical, but they were very, very close, because I think most people who knew Larry and know me, I said a few things here in this interview that most people say, yeah, that would go along with Larry McDonald. So he was we came together because we were both strict constitutionalists, which we felt obligated to follow.
And of course, we need more strict constitutionalists in office like yourself and Larry McDonald. But speaking about the Constitution, there are some today who favor using the Constitution to specifically the Article 5 part of the Constitution to amend the Constitution to rein in the federal government. Because Article 5 allows for amending the Constitution either through 2/3 of both chambers of Congress propose the amendments and then the states ratify, or the states can submit resolutions to Congress requesting for a convention, also known as a constitutional convention. Do you think that states should be pursuing this idea of a constitutional convention or convention of states as the best way to rein in the federal government, or could that cause more problems than what they realize?
Obviously, the states overriding a lackadaisical Congress was put in there, and the founders believed in it, and I believe in it. I don't think I'd remove it, but the circumstances today would be very dangerous, because what happens in Washington and what's happening in our country today as a result of of an educational system and a prevailing attitude. So that has to change. So we don't have people milling around in this country interested in politics that have an understanding that the founders had when they overcame a lot of obstacles, and was able to, precipitate and bring about a revolution and the Constitution. So I think it would be dangerous now, because I think we have to work harder to get more people to understand, and it can't be done in the government school system. And that's one of the reasons why I have a homeschooling program, to try to, get people involved that would have a better understanding that someday that we would have intelligent people believing in liberty that would be willing to deal with the Constitution. The truth is, though, the middle of the road up there is, yes, you can believe in that. If circumstances are right, do it. But right now, what we need are just more people that would read the one we have. It's not perfect. There's a few things I would clarify in it, but it's something that it is worthwhile if we followed it. It would be a tremendous. Just take the money issue. Only gold and silver can be legal tender. What if it was you can't go to war unless war is declared? That deals with two big subjects, and I deal with foreign policy and monetary policy and economic. So that in itself would go a long way. But having a convention, the odds are that it would probably get watered down, not improved.
Yeah, one of our really good friends, Thomas Massey, who we've both had on our respected shows, he tweeted back some time ago in 2018, I believe it was, that Congress doesn't follow the Constitution we have. You mentioned the declaration of war aspect. You mentioned the monetary policy of using gold and silver as sound currency. If they don't abide by that now, Thomas Massey tweeted at the time, why would they abide by a new Constitution or a new set of amendments devised today?
No, I don't think they would. You'd have to have new people. But we could get new people right now. Uh, but you know, what's that likely to be uh, under today's circumstances of where we would get a broad majority of people to vote against an unbalanced budget and against going to war? I mean, that's not going to happen. That's why I think the real fight, I think, is what the Birch Society does. And they've been in that business for a long time, and it's education. Robert Welch that was his goal, was to educate people, to the fact of what would bring about a special order, and produce a better society. So that is what would happen. So I think you can run for Congress even with understanding that it's education, but you can't go to Congress with the idea that I'm going to become a chairman, I'm going to fight the system. It wouldn't work. You're not going to get anywhere unless you sell out. You'd have to sell out. It happens the first day you're in Congress. No matter what you campaigned on, a lot of people campaign on good principle. But the very first day, the leadership gets you. Well, what committee you want? Well, you'll do this, 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 this. They lay down the rules so that you get your committee, and then you get a promise. Oh, I'm going to raise some money for you. So the system isn't a very good system for sure.
Absolutely. And an Article 5 convention or a constitutional convention, convention of the states, whatever they want to call it, isn't a solution either to fix the problem, because like Barry Goldwater once said, you'd have everyone left and right being at the convention, and what you would end up would be so far different than the republic we have today. Well, Dr. Paul, I know we're essentially out of time right now, and I want to thank you so much for you taking the time that you have taken for this interview today. So, of course, take care. God bless you. Stay safe, and we'd love to have you on again in the future if that permits with your schedule and ours, of course.
Very nice. Nice to be with you today.
Thank you so much. God bless.